In this video, we'll demonstrate the historical accuracy of Daniel 5. Reminder to hit the subscribe button below and turn on the notification bell to stay up to date as new videos come out. And if you're interested in supporting this ministry, just go to justscripture.org and click on the support page. Daniel 5 is a chapter where critics quickly turn to try to point out historical inaccuracies that tries to undermine the entirety of the book and early authorship. This chapter describes the very night that the Babylonians fell to the Medo-Persian Empire under Cyrus the Great in 539 BC. So we have roughly moved 24 years in advance from the events of chapter 4 with Nebuchadnezzar's madness. Chapter 5 also begins our reversing out on the Aramaic chiasm in chapters 2 through 7. Here the focus is on God's sovereignty over King Belshazzar. The interesting thing on our timeline is that we know that chapter 5 is to be dated at 539, but that chapters 7 and 8 both occur over 12 years before this. Since 7 and 8 are all about prophecies concerning future Gentile empires, we know that Daniel would have had these prophecies in mind during the night that Babylon fell to Cyrus. Another thing is that since Daniel was about 14 at the time of chapter 1, we know that he's now pushing about 80 years old at this point. Now, with the Babylonian Empire coming to a close, we can point out how perfect the Bible is aligned with the reigns of its 7 kings. So never shy away from someone who says that the Bible is a fictional book with a bunch of fairy tales. Now, if you love family trees and genealogies just as much as I do, then this one is going to knock your socks right off. I've generated Nebuchadnezzar's family tree because it's going to offer us a lot more insight into some very important details in this chapter that just shows how accurate it truly is. We see our 4 main powers in the Near East here. Their children fall in place with Nebuchadnezzar right in the middle. Now he ends up marrying both Pharaoh Necho's and Cyaxares, daughters likely to form alliances in some nature. And here's how the rest of the tree falls below this. And highlighted in orange are those that are mentioned in the Old Testament. But when we compare how these figures connect with Nebuchadnezzar, one of the important things that we see is that Belshazzar is the grandson of Nebuchadnezzar by his daughter Nabonidus. Wasn't that cool? But try to keep that mental picture in mind as we go through some of the objections in chapter 5. Verse 1. Belshazzar the king made a great feast to 1,000 of his lords, and drank wine before the 1,000. Belshazzar, while he tasted the wine, commanded to bring the golden and silver vessels which his father Nebuchadnezzar had taken out of the temple which was in Jerusalem, that the king and his princes, his wives, and his concubines might drink therein. Then they brought the golden vessels that were taken out of the temple of the house of God, which was at Jerusalem, and the king and his princes, his wives, and his concubines drank in them. They drank wine and praised the gods of gold and of silver, of brass, of iron, of wood, and of stone. What might surprise you is that in just these first 2 verses have been 4 objections that have been raised by critics over the years. First, they challenge whether or not Belshazzar even existed. That would then, attack chapters 7 and 8 because those chapters are attached to a ruling year of his. Next, him being called king, and for that matter, he would be then deemed the last king of Babylon. Next is his feast for 1,000 lords, as this is a number that is simply way too high to be possibly even done. And then the repeated descriptions of Nebuchadnezzar being called his father, or him being called the son of Nebuchadnezzar. What's always important to remember in this is that adamant critics are simply fishing for an excuse to dismiss the whole book as altogether. So let's quickly chop down each one of these one by one. Attacking Belshazzar's existence is really an old objection that was raised in the 19th century by German Bible critic Ferdinand Hitzig, who said, even supposing that the king of the Medes in question, i.e. Darius, Daniel 5:31, had existed, the objection is the name under which he is referenced in Daniel. Each of the 2 were standardized in Nabonidus equaling Belshazzar, which is repeated in Cyaxares equaling Darius, to Daniel's discredit. What he is saying is that everyone knew that Nabonidus was the last king, but that the author of Daniel made a huge historical error saying that the last king was Belshazzar. His argument was based on that no available records at that time ever even mentioned Belshazzar. So the conclusion was that he never existed, and thus the book of Daniel is in error and must have been written much later because no contemporary person would have made such a terrible mistake. So this would have been an argument from silence, but one that was probably pretty justifiable at that point in history, because, to much of Hitzig's chagrin, it only took a few years later, with the advent of Near East archaeology, that Belshazzar burst forth onto the scene. The Nabonidus cylinder has Nabonidus calling Belshazzar his firstborn son. Alright, so he actually existed and the Bible got one right. It's not a big deal. It's not like it proves that the book was written early. Actually, it does. Because the critic's position is that some anonymous Jew wrote this book nearly 400 years after the events in 539 BC. And as Hitzig correctly pointed out, none of the ancient Greek historians ever mentioned him. So here's the question, critics. How is it possible for your anonymous 2nd century author to get this right when nobody else had ever mentioned him before? He simply couldn't have copied it off of somebody else's work. So it's really not possible, is it? And it means that only an eyewitness account coming from the 6th century makes sense. So number 1 is not used anymore for obvious reasons. Number 2 is still used quite a bit, but I don't understand why, because of 3 recorded accounts. First is the Persian verse account of Nabonidus in the British Museum. It says, "Putting the camp under the rule of his oldest son, the firstborn, the army of the empire he placed under his command. His hands were now free. He entrusted the authority of the royal throne to him." And as we just saw in the Nabonidus Chronicle, Belshazzar is his firstborn son. Next, from the Yale Babylonian collection, is the interpretation of Nabonidus' dream. Here, Nabonidus calls Belshazzar the crown prince. Now yes, this isn't him calling him the king, but as we saw, Nabonidus did give him full authority over the kingdom. And the final account coming from King Cyrus himself, saying on the famous Cyrus cylinder that a coward was put in charge as the king of this country. It may not say Belshazzar, but there is no doubt that it's referring to him. So number 2 should stop being used. Number 3 is really easy to refute as well. First, in Esther 1, it talks about a 180-day feast that King Xerxes threw for all his princes and servants in the provinces. And an Assyrian stela of Ashurnasirpal described him throwing a 10-day feast for nearly 70,000 people. So all that leaves us with are the verses that repeatedly say that Nebuchadnezzar is Belshazzar's father, or saying that Belshazzar is the son of Nebuchadnezzar. Because in verse 2, it explicitly says his father Nebuchadnezzar. That is then repeated in verses 11, 13, 18, and 22. But as we saw, Belshazzar is clearly called or is the grandson of Nebuchadnezzar. The simple answer is that both Aramaic and Hebrew do not have words for grandson or grandfather. They simply have a word that implies a descendant. And this is easily confirmed in other scripture. Elijah is called Elisha's father. But 1 Kings 19:16 quite clearly says that Elisha is the son of Shaphat. Jesus is called the son of David, and the Jews refer to Abraham as their father in the New Testament, which are obviously both just referring to their lineage, and the Assyrians did the same as Shalmaneser called King Jehu a son of Omri. And as you can see, there are 3 kings and 30 years between Omri and Jehu. But the bigger catch to this is that Jehu wasn't even a descendant of Omri. He actually starts the 4th ruling dynasty of the northern kingdom of Israel. So him being called a son of someone had a wide variety of meaning in the ancient world. See how bad these arguments really are? It's just the critics trying to grasp straws to find one little error in the book to try to throw the baby out with the bathwater with Daniel and really the Bible as a whole. Now what corroborates Belshazzar's feast on the night of the fall is Xenophon's account in his work called the Cyropedia. He states, "Thus his armies was employed, but the men within the walls laughed at his preparations, knowing they had supplies to last them more than 20 years. When Cyrus heard that, he divided his army into 12 each division to keep guard for 1 month in the year. So the available stock of food was extremely high, and since the Euphrates River ran through the city, the Babylonians didn't have to worry about water as well. This confirms the ease to which Belshazzar could easily host 1,000 people. What history tells us is that Cyrus had his army digging trenches for months to divert the river. Xenophon continues saying, "However, by this time the trenches were dug, and Cyrus heard that it was a time of high festival in Babylon, when his citizens drink and make merry the whole night long. As soon as the darkness fell, he set his men to work." This is exactly what we just read in verse 1, 2, 3, and 4. So Xenophon's account provides us with the scene that's happening outside of the walls, while Daniel is telling us what's taking place inside the king's palace. Daniel continues in verse 5. "In the same hour came forth fingers of a man's hand, and wrote against over the candlestick upon the plaster of the wall of the king's palace. And the king saw the part of the hand that wrote. Then the king's countenance was changed, and his thoughts troubled him, so that the joints of his loins were loosed, and his knees smote one against another." So Belshazzar is scared off his rear, so much that verse 6 says the joints of his loins were loosed. The Christian Standard Bible gives us a more modern and vivid understanding of this. They say that he soiled himself. But for Daniel and other Jews, they would have seen this as a fulfillment of the Cyrus prophecy from Isaiah happening right before their eyes. Isaiah 45:1 says, "Thus saith the Lord to his anointed, to Cyrus, whose right hand I have holden, to subdue nations before him, and I will loose the loins of the kings, to open before him the two-leaved gates, and the gate shall not be shut." And because Isaiah comes 200 years before these events, critics attack this prophecy as well for the same reasons that we're dealing with Daniel here. They won't allow for predictive prophecy of the naming of Cyrus and the accurate description of the fall of Babylon to be possible. So critics have invented a multiple authorship view to Isaiah and make chapter 44 and 45 be written during the exile period and claim editorial additions to compensate for the naming of Cyrus and the descriptions of the fall of Babylon. See why understanding the authorship debate is so important? Critics and skeptics will staunchly object to this possibility because the only alternative that is left is that the God of the Bible is then real. So regardless of how much evidence we throw at them, many will simply harden their heart and say something like, "You can't prove that that's what the originals actually said, and that we just don't have the copies from potential editorial editions after the fact." You will hear this when, discussing Jesus' quotes when he called himself the Son of Man, or when he equated himself with God. But here's the problem. Even if you allow for the critical view to be even a possibility, they still have to deal with the hundreds of messianic prophecies that predate Jesus by over hundreds of years. So even if a person thinks that they're outsmarting the Bible, Christian apologists, or really God himself for that matter, they are really not, because they can't account for the prophecies that talk about a second exiling of the Jews and the destruction of the Second Temple under the Romans during the 70 AD revolt. God knew a day would come when Bible critics would try their best to rip apart his word, but he made sure to put some that were completely unchallengeable. Now there is a detail in verse 5 that many will probably overlook, but don't realize the real significance of it. And that special detail is the plaster on the king's wall. Think about this for a moment. Why would, or really how could, a Jew in the 2nd century BC living in Judea possibly know that in the king's throne room that plaster covered the wall? Because at the ruins of the king's palace in Babylon, archaeologists have uncovered a large throne room 56 feet wide and 170 feet long, and interestingly, the wall behind the niche was covered with white plaster. Let that just sink in for a moment. Now let me tell you why a Jew in 165 BC is not going to know if there was plaster on the wall or not. Because in 331, Alexander conquered the Persians and began ruling in Babylon. But 8 years later, he died. And after his death, the Greek Empire was split into 4 ruling territories, with the Diadochi Wars ensuing for the next 50 years. At the end of the wars, the Seleucid Empire deported all of the residents of Babylon in 275 BC. So what do you have there? Well, you have 110 years up to the critic's date with nobody living in Babylon. So what do you think, critic? You think your anonymous Jewish author took a 1,000-mile stroll to Babylon during the Maccabean revolt and saw a plaster on the king's wall and thought, hey, I might as well include that in my forged book? You see how your view never jives with history when held under the microscope? You need to accept that Daniel is nothing but 6th century BC eyewitness account written all over it. Pun intended. Man, that was a lot for just 6 verses, wasn't it? Back to Belshazzar. The king cried aloud to bring in the astrologers, the Chaldeans, and the soothsayers. And the king spoke and said to the wise men of Babylon, Whosoever shall read this writing, and show me the interpretation thereof, shall be clothed with scarlet and have a gold chain about his neck, and shall be the 3rd ruler in the kingdom. Question here. Why does the author say 3rd ruler in the kingdom? Why isn't 2nd available? The reason is because the eyewitness Daniel knew that Belshazzar was 2nd in the land to his father Nabonidus, and that 3rd rank was the highest position of authority that Belshazzar could offer. Verse 8. Then came in all the king's wise men, but could not read the writing, nor make known to the king the interpretation thereof. Then was the king Belshazzar greatly troubled, and his countenance was changed in him, and his lords were astonished. Yeah, he's still freaking out. Now the queen, by reason of the words of the king and his lords, came into the banquet house. And the queen spoke and said, O king, live forever, and let not thy thoughts trouble thee, nor let the countenance be changed. Now, this queen is likely Nabonidus' wife and Belshazzar's mom, which is why you would read the Queen Mother in the New Living, Good News, and Net Bible translations. Verse 11. There is a man in thy kingdom in whom the spirit of the holy gods. This should sound familiar to us because of the prior chapter of Nebuchadnezzar saying the same thing of Daniel. And in the days of thy father light and understanding and wisdom, like the wisdom of the gods, was found in him, whom King Nebuchadnezzar, thy father, the king, I say, thy father, made master of magicians, astrologers, Chaldeans, and soothsayers. Forasmuch as an excellent spirit and knowledge and understanding, interpreting of dreams, and showing of hard sentences, and dissolving of doubts, were found in the same Daniel, whom the king named Belteshazzar. Now let Daniel be called, and he will show the interpretation. So, once again, Daniel is called last upon the scene. Then was Daniel brought in before the king, and the king spoke and said unto Daniel, Art thou that Daniel, which art of the children of the captivity of Judah, whom the king my father brought out of Jewry? I have even heard of thee, that the spirit of the gods is in thee, and that light and understanding and excellent wisdom is found in thee. Oh, what fake flattery. And now the wise men, the astrologers, have been brought in before me, that they should read this writing, and make known unto me the interpretation thereof, but they could not show me the interpretation of the thing. And I have heard of thee that you can make interpretations and dissolve doubts. Now if you can read the writing and make known to me the interpretation thereof, you shall be clothed with scarlet, and have a chain of gold about thy neck, and shall be the 3rd ruler in the kingdom. This scene is so typical of the world. For the past 5 chapters, it's been nothing but clear evidence to Nebuchadnezzar, and now Belshazzar, that their wise men are really worthless. Even when they knew they had a sure thing with Daniel, they kept going their own route and asking for him last, which is the same way that the world operates today. I'll do it myself, and if that doesn't work, maybe I'll just seek out people who are just like me. But until one completely exhausts all their outlets and resources, do they finally say, oh, maybe I'll ask, that Christian friend of mine and see what they have to say, or they just give up altogether. Because even if they know that their Christian friend does have good advice, the unbeliever really doesn't want to hear it because they know that God is going to be attached to it. So, part of the reason why God lets people suffer in the worldly sense and completely bottom out altogether is because in many cases, it's the only point in a person's life where they finally call on God for help. Because His number one concern is not where you currently are, but where He wants you to be in eternity. Verse 17. Then Daniel answered and said before the king, Let thy gifts be thyself, and give thy rewards to another. Yet I will read the writing unto the king, and make known to him the interpretation. Daniel tells him that he doesn't want his reward of power and fortune. But something to note here is that Daniel is not rejecting a power position to remain loyal to Yahweh in a sense, because earlier he accepted Nebuchadnezzar's promotion and later a Persian one as well. What Daniel understands is that Babylon is going down tonight. He knows it because of the inscription that he'll interpret soon, but he remembers of Nebuchadnezzar's dream of the head of gold that would eventually be overthrown by an empire represented in silver. Then, chronologically, he received the vision of the four beasts that was given to him about the winged lion that was going to be defeated by the bear in chapter 7. Then, 2 years later, God revealed to him the prophecy of the ram and goat, and the ram was directly identified with Medo-Persia. Plus, there was a good chance that he knew of the numerous Isaiah prophecies about a coming judgment on Babylon. Verse 18. O thou king, the Most High God has given Nebuchadnezzar thy father a kingdom, and majesty, and glory, and honor. And for the majesty that he gave him, all people, nations, and languages trembled and feared before him. Some he would slay, and some he would keep alive, and some he would set up, and some he would put down. But when his heart was lifted up, and his mind hardened in pride, he was disposed from his kingly throne, and they took his glory from him. And he was driven from the sons of men, and his heart was made like the beasts, and his dwelling place was like the wild asses. They fed him with the grass like oxen, and his body was wet with the dew of heaven, till he knew that the Most High God ruled in the kingdom of men, and that he appointeth over it whomsoever he wills. So Daniel reminds Belshazzar of the events of chapter 4 that he should have remembered from family story time growing up. Verse 22. And thou, his son, O Belshazzar, hast not humbled thine heart, though thou knewest all of this. But hast thou lifted up thyself against the Lord of heaven, and they brought the vessels of his house before thee, and thou, thy lords, thy wives, thy concubines, have drunk wine in them. And thou hast praised the God of silver and gold and of brass, iron, wood, and stone, which see not, nor hear, nor know. And the God in whose hand thy breath is, and who are all thy ways, hast thou not glorified. Then was the part of the hand sent from him, and this was the writing. And this is the writing that was written. Many, many tekel a parson. One thing to notice here is that many was written twice. This double effect is an indicator to Daniel that these events are coming imminently. Verse 26. This is the interpretation of the thing. Many, God hath numbered thy kingdom, and finished it. Tekel, thou art weighed in the balances, and art found wanting. Paris, thy kingdom is divided, and given to the Medes and Persians. Now there's still debate amongst scholars whether or not the inscription was written in Aramaic or even in Hebrew. Or was it written vertically from right to left, and that's the reason why the wise men couldn't even interpret it, or maybe even be able to read it. But honestly, none of that really matters, because even if they knew what the words were, trying to explain their meaning coming from ghostwriter wasn't going to happen. However, Daniel knew that God was moving into phase 2 of his Gentile empire plan, and Daniel spelled out the important parts even to us. He said that the Babylonian kingdom was finished and was going to be given to the Medes and Persians. And that makes chapter 5 the transition point in the statute from the Golden Empire of Babylon to the combined Medo-Persian Empire of silver. And what makes note here is that Daniel clearly speaks of the Medes and Persians as unified, because this is a clear failure on the critics' part who try to split the Medes and Persians apart to make Greece be the fourth empire instead of the Romans. And then to add insult to injury, all historians and records side with the biblical view on this as well. Verse 29. Then commanded Belshazzar, and they clothed Daniel with scarlet, and put a chain of gold about his neck, and made a proclamation concerning him, that he should be the third ruler in the kingdom. Old man Daniel's back on top again, but you can assume that he wasn't smiling through the coronation ceremony, because he knew that Babylon was going to fall that night. So now we only have 2 verses left, but oh man, are they attacked by the critics. Verses 30 and 31. In that night was Belshazzar the king of the Chaldeans slain, and Darius the Median took the kingdom, being about 62 years old. Now on the surface, it may seem as if these final 2 verses are saying Darius the Mede was the one who conquered Babylon and killed Belshazzar that night. But the historical record is quite clear that it was Cyrus, and even the Isaiah prophecy said it was to be Cyrus as the one who would conquer Babylon. 2 extra other notes on verse 31 is that first is the line about took the kingdom is better understood as Darius received the kingdom, which you see that is done in many other versions. This tells the reader that somebody else gave him authority over Babylon, which is why Daniel 9 says that Darius was made king over the realm of the Chaldeans. And the other note on verse 31 is that in the Jewish Bible, verse 31 actually starts chapter 6 for them. I personally like this more because it does reflect better the chronological separation between the conquering of Babylon and Darius being made king. And if you think about chapter 6 with Daniel in the lion's den, verse 31 fits really nicely as the starting point to this story as well. Now, if you know anything about this whole Daniel controversy, you know that the critics' number 1 objection to the book are the references to Darius the Mede. They accuse the author of making up a fictional character because they say that there are no governmental records that bear witness to this person. Since this is their main objection, it requires a separate video because honestly there is a lot of disagreement even within the Christian circles over his identity. Now to close out our video, we are going to go back outside of the city walls and let Xenophon describe the events of that night. When the great stream had taken its new channel, Cyrus ordered his Persian officers to bring up their thousands, horse and foot alike, each detached drawn up 2 deep, the allies to follow in their old order. And Cyrus said, "Tonight we go against when some are asleep and some are drunk, and all are unprepared, and when they learn that we are within the walls, sheer astonishment will make them still more helpless than before. Come, take your swords in your hand, God helping me, I will lead you on. Do you," he said, turning to Nabonidus and Gobryas, "show us the streets, you know them, and once we are inside, lead us straight to the palace." "So we will," Gobryas and his men said, "and it will not surprise us to find the palace gates unbarred, for this night the whole city is given over to revelry. Still, we are sure to find a guard, for one is always stationed there." Then said Cyrus, "There is no time for lingering. We must be off at once and take them unprepared." Thereupon they entered, and of those they met some that were struck down and slain, and others fled into their houses, and some raised the hue and cry. But Gobryas and his friends covered the cry with their shouts, as though they were revelers themselves. And thus, making their way by the quickest route, they soon found themselves before the king's palace. Here the detachment under Gobryas and Nabonidus found the gates closed, but the men appointed to attack the guards rushed on them, and as they lay drinking around a blazing fire, and closed with them then and there. And as the din grew louder and louder, those within became aware of the tumult, till King Belshazzar, bidding them to see what it meant, some of them opened the gates and ran out. Nabonidus and his men, seeing the gates swing wide open, darted in, hard on the heels of the others who fled back again, and they chased them at the sword's point into the presence of King Belshazzar. And they found him on his feet, with his drawn small sword in his hand. By sheer weight and numbers they overwhelmed him, and not one of his assistants escaped. They were all cut down, some flying, others snatching up anything to serve as a shield and defending themselves as best they could. And when it was day, and those who held the heights knew that the city was taken, and the king slain, they were persuaded to surrender the citadels themselves. And Cyrus took it over forthwith. Xenophon's account matches perfectly with Daniel 5 saying that everyone was drunk off of partying and Belshazzar being slain that very night. The biggest takeaway for us is that we have met our objective in showing that Daniel 5 is historically accurate, much to the chagrin of the critic. And never forget that you can always add Josephus to the conversation that supports Daniel as well. No matter how hard the critics have tried over the past 2 centuries, Daniel has always ended up being shown to be true. Reminder to hit the subscribe button below, turn on the notification bell, hit the like button, leave a comment. And don't forget to visit us at justscripture.org. In the meantime, stay salty.